Okay, so imagine, just picture this. Stepping back in time to the U.S. In the early 1900s. A nation, really, on the edge of massive change, right? Dealing with, like, all the challenges of rapid industrialization. That's what we're going today, diving headfirst into President Woodrow Wilson's time in office. And we'll untangle the whole story of the progressive movement and how it connected with his new freedom agenda. We're talking trust busting, women
Yeah.
finally getting to vote, and a whole bunch of things that are still impacting us even now.
What's really interesting is that the progressive movement wasn't just some abstract idea. It came directly from the struggles that everyday Americans were facing. Industrialization brought incredible wealth, sure, and amazing technology, yeah. But it also came with a pretty hefty price tag. Monopolies were basically strangling competition, working conditions were often really unsafe, and government corruption, well, that was just running rampant.
So these progressives weren't just like complaining on the sidelines. They were out there fighting, right, to break up those huge trusts, pushing for women to have the right to vote, and demanding better, safer working conditions. It's kind of wild how some of those same issues are still around today, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It just shows you that progress, it's not a straight line. It's more of a constant back and forth, like a cycle where each generation kind of faces the same problems,
Hmm.
but dressed up in different clothes. We
Yeah.
can really see the legacy of the progressive era in our own debates about corporate power, social equality, and what the government should be doing, right?
Right, exactly. Okay, so let's bring Woodrow Wilson into this picture. Our 28th president, leading the country from 1913 to 1921. He was a progressive Democrat, for sure. But he also came with his own agenda, what he called the new freedom. Think about things like regulating big businesses, supporting workers, and even guiding the U.S. through those crazy World War I years. That's a lot to handle, don't you think?
Oh, yeah, he definitely had his hands full. And that's what makes Wilson such an interesting figure, right? He was this mix of progressive ideas. And let's be honest, some views that were kind of stuck in the past. You see him pushing for big reforms, but then he kind of stumbles when it comes to racial equality. He was a complicated guy, to put it mildly.
Okay, so let's break down some of his key policies then. Starting with the economic stuff, right? First up, we've got the Underwood Tariff Act of 1913. This one was a big deal because it seriously slashed those tariffs on imported goods. What was the idea there? Well, Wilson believed that lowering those tariffs would make things more affordable for the average American, and it would also boost international trade.
Yeah, this move was a direct challenge to those old protectionist policies, the ones that had always favored big corporations. By lowering those trade barriers, Wilson was trying to shake things up, bring more competition to the market, and give consumers more power, basically.
Then you've got the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. This was all about going after those massive monopolies, the ones that were stifling competition, right?
Yeah.
This was a huge win for the progressives because it made the Sherman Antitrust Act even stronger. It spelled things out very clearly, defining exactly what counted as anti-competitive behavior. So those companies couldn't just weasel their way out of their responsibilities.
Right, it wasn't just about breaking them up. It was about changing how the government and the economy interacted, really. It was a clear sign that the government was taking a more active role in regulation because they realized that a totally free market wouldn't always be fair to everyone. It was all about creating a level playing field for businesses and consumers alike.
And to keep everyone honest, Wilson also pushed for the creation of the Federal Trade Commission, right, in 1914. These guys weren't messing around. They were like the corporate watchdogs. Their job was to investigate businesses
Yeah.
and take them to court if they were doing shady stuff.
Yeah, the FTC was a turning point. It signaled a big change in how Americans thought about the government's role in the economy. People started to realize that in a complex market like ours, you need an agency dedicated to making sure the rules are followed, to protecting consumers and ensuring fair competition. It wasn't just about regulation, it was about keeping people safe.
Then there's the big one, the most important economic policy maybe, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which, as you might guess, created the Federal Reserve, the central banking system for the entire U.S. This gave the government a lot more control over the money supply, and that meant they could do more to stabilize the economy.
Oh, that was a huge change before the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
The U.S. financial system was pretty chaotic, lots of panic, some times of instability. This act was supposed to create a system that was more resilient, one that could adapt to the ups and downs that always happen in the economy, ride out the waves.
Which I guess it has been doing for over 100 years now. It's
Yeah.
pretty impressive when you think about it.
It really is. It shows how much of an impact a single law can have, right?
Yeah.
The Federal Reserve Act totally changed how American finance works.
It did, totally. And it shows just how committed Wilson was to using the government's power to tackle these massive economic problems. But he didn't stop there. He also had his sights set on social reforms. And that's where things get even more interesting.
Oh, absolutely. One really striking example of this is the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act. Now, it's true that the Supreme Court ended up striking it down, but it was still a big deal.
Why is that?
Well, because it really shows how aware people were becoming of the problems with child labor, the moral and social costs, right? It shows that the progressive movement was gaining momentum. Public opinion was shifting. People were starting to say, hey, this isn't right. Kids should be in school, not working in factories.
Yeah, that's a pretty big change in how people were thinking. And it wasn't just about protecting kids, right? Wilson also pushed for better conditions for adult workers, too. Take the Adamson Acts, for example. That one set an 8-hour workday for railroad workers, a major win for labor unions.
Absolutely. And let's not forget about the Workingmen's Compensation Act either. That one gave important support to federal workers, the civil service employees, if they got hurt on the job. All these acts really highlight how the federal government's role was changing. They were becoming more involved in protecting workers' rights and making sure they had some basic economic security.
Yeah, they really show how the relationship between the government, workers, and businesses was evolving. But, one of the most significant things that happened during Wilson's presidency has got to be the passage of the 19th Amendment. Can you imagine what the women who fought so hard for suffrage, what they would think about our political landscape today?
Wow, yeah. It blows my mind to think about it. All those years of activism, their dedication, their unwavering belief in the power of their voices. The 19th Amendment was the result of decades of fighting. It's a testament to how powerful social movements can be.
And it wasn't just a symbolic victory either. It completely changed who could vote in this country, giving women a seat at the table, opening up so many new possibilities for political participation. It's a legacy that we still benefit from today.
Definitely. But it's important to remember, right, that even though we celebrate the passage of the 19th Amendment, the fight for women's equality wasn't over, not by a long shot. For a lot of women of color, the right to vote was still out of reach. Because of discrimination and all these systemic barriers, it reminds us that progress isn't always fair or even, and that the fight for justice never really ends.
Yeah, it's a journey we're still on today, that's for sure. Well, let's get back to Wilson for a minute. It's interesting how his legacy is kind of a mixed bag. He was praised for his leadership during World War I and for some of his progressive reforms, but he was also criticized a lot for his views on race and his support for segregation. It's hard to square those two sides of it.
Yeah, he was full of contradictions, wasn't he? On the one hand, he was championing democracy and international cooperation out there on the world stage. But on the other hand, he clung to these really flawed beliefs about race and equality. It reminds us that history, and the people who make it, they're rarely just good or bad. They're complex, capable of both great vision and serious shortcomings.
It makes you wonder how we're supposed to judge these historical figures.
Right.
Do we focus on their accomplishments and kind of overlook their failings, or do we hold them to today's standards of morality, even though they lived in completely different times?
It's a question that historians grapple with all the time. And there aren't any easy answers, but I think it's important to avoid just labeling people as good or bad. Instead, we should try to understand them in all their complexity, acknowledge both their achievements and their flaws, because it's through that kind of nuanced lens that we can really learn from history.
Yeah, I think you're right. So let's switch gears a bit and talk about the end of Wilson's presidency. It's actually kind of a sad chapter in his story. In 1919, he had a really bad stroke. It left him partially paralyzed. Can you imagine the impact that must have had? Not just on him personally, but on the country as a whole.
Oh, yeah, it was a huge turning point for both Wilson and the nation. His wife, Edith, she basically stepped in to handle his presidential duties, kept him out of the public eye, and made some really important decisions during a critical time.
Wow, she must have been an incredible woman to take on all that. But because of his illness, Wilson couldn't really promote one of his most important projects, the League of Nations. Kind of like a precursor to the United Nations. He had this vision of this international organization that would prevent future wars and encourage global cooperation. It was an idea born out of the horrors of World War I, a war that had really shaken the entire world.
It's really a tragedy when you think about it. Wilson put everything he had into the League. He saw it as the key to lasting peace. He believed that only by working together, Could nations overcome those forces of nationalism and aggression? The things that led to such devastating conflict.
Yeah, but sadly, even with all his efforts, the U.S. Senate rejected joining the League. It was a huge blow to Wilson, and some historians argue that this isolationist stance actually contributed to the outbreak of World War II, just 20 years later.
That's a scary thought, isn't it? To think that Wilson's dream of a world united to stop war, it ultimately failed, partly because of his own health problems. It really shows how fragile peace is and how unexpected events can shape the course of history.
Yeah, it's a sobering reminder that even the best plans can fall apart. Wilson left office in 1921 a shell of his former self, and he died just 3 years later. His story reminds us that even the most powerful people are still human, vulnerable to the twists and turns of fate.
Absolutely. It's a humbling thought. It challenges us to look beyond those big historical narratives and remember the individuals behind them, their hopes, their struggles, their triumphs, and their failures. In the end, history is a story about people, and we should try to understand them in all their complexity.
Wow, yeah, you're right. We've covered a lot in this deep dive, haven't we?
Yeah.
From the rise of the progressive movement to Wilson's complicated legacy and his kind of tragic downfall. It's been a fascinating journey through a really important time in American history.
It really has a lot to think about. It really makes you think about the weight of leadership, doesn't it? All those decisions, the battles they fought, it's still shaping our world today in so many ways.
It really does. It's like we're carrying their legacy forward, building on what they did right and learning from their mistakes.
That's a great way to put it. Wilson's era, with all its ups and downs and contradictions, it's like a lens we can use to look at our own time. It makes us think about those fundamental questions that never seem to go away.
Yeah, like what?
Like, how much power should the government have? How do we find that balance between individual freedom and making progress as a society? And maybe the most important one, what can we learn from both the good and the bad of the progressive era?
Those are some heavy questions, and I don't think there are easy answers.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the whole point, right? To keep wrestling with these ideas, to keep talking about history, and to use what we learn to deal with the problems we face today.
Exactly. History isn't just some, dead thing from the past. It's a living conversation that keeps going from one generation to the next. And by being part of that conversation, by really looking at the past, we can get some amazing insights into the present and the future.
So to everyone listening, we encourage you to keep digging deeper into the progressive era. Uncover those stories of the people and the movements that shaped such a crazy time in our history. And as you explore, think about what those stories tell us about ourselves, about what we value, and about the world we're trying to build. Because history isn't just something that happened a long time ago, it's still happening, and we're all part of it.
It really is fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and you know what? It makes you realize that even though we're talking about events from over a century ago, they still have this power to resonate with us today. It's like those echoes of the past are still shaping our present in ways we might not even realize.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to keep exploring these historical moments, to understand how the decisions and actions of those who came before us continue to influence our world. Whether it's the economic structures we operate within, the social challenges we face, or the political systems that govern our lives.
I totally agree. And I think one of the most compelling aspects of studying history is that it allows us to learn from both the triumphs and the mistakes of the past. It's like by understanding where we've been, we can get a better sense of where we're going and maybe even avoid repeating some of those same errors.
Absolutely, and that's what's so fascinating about Wilson's era. It's full of these incredible advancements, these bold reforms that sought to address the injustices of the time, but it also highlights the limitations of those efforts, the areas where progress fell short or even backfired.
It's a reminder that history isn't always a neat and tidy narrative, right? It's messy, it's complicated, and it's full of unintended consequences.
Precisely, and that's why it's so crucial to approach history with a critical eye, not just to celebrate the victories, but also to grapple with the complexities, the contradictions, and the unresolved issues that continue to shape our present.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into President Wilson's progressive era, we want to leave you with a few final thoughts to ponder. First, remember that history is an ongoing conversation, not just a static collection of facts and figures. So keep asking questions, keep challenging assumptions, and keep seeking out diverse perspectives. Because the more we understand about our past, the better equipped we are to navigate the challenges of our present and shape a more just and equitable future.
Well said. And don't be afraid to dig deeper into the stories and the voices that are often left out of the mainstream narratives. because it's often in those marginalized perspectives that we find the most powerful insights and the most compelling calls to action.
Absolutely. And remember, history isn't just about what happened in the past, it's also about what's happened right now and what we choose to do next. So let's learn from those who came before us and strive to create a world that's worthy of their sacrifices and their dreams. Thanks for joining us on this journey, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the fascinating world of history.
Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.